Thank you very much. Thank you, Olivier, and thank you everybody for being here. Well, today, first of all, let me thank Maurizio Ferraz for his presentation and also for eliciting some very interesting remarks that actually, especially I'm thinking about the last one by De Martin, kind of puts me in a better position, because to tell you the truth, at the beginning I was kind of intimidated by the framework of this conference. Total mobilization, okay, of course everybody has to interpret the very notion of mobilization in his or her own way, and mine, the kind of angle that I've chosen, is to understand mobilization in terms of labor mobilization and the kind of way we can organize human collectives around labor and around productive activities online, and how these can shape a sphere of social conflict. Of course, this is related to the notion of digital labor, which is kind of an emergent notion as such, and that deserves a better definition. First of all, okay, I have arranged this in a kind of Ikebana way, but you will forgive me, I think. It's just to show you that there is a production, an increasing, growing corpus of literature, body of literature about digital labor, and the field as such has been shaping up in the last 5 to 10 years. Actually, it started to become prominent on an international level in 2009, when we had the first digital labor conference in New York, and it's going on, and it's been going on so far with a number of prominent books. The one I would like to mention is Digital Labor, The Internet as Playground and Factory, edited by Trevor Schultz, and of course, but this is just, shallow self-promotion, the Cascade of Digital Labor, which is the first one which was published in French, and it's kind of important despite the fact that it's kind of a mixed title, and that we decided not to translate the word digital labor, which is a choice, because actually whenever you try and translate it in another language, especially in French, a number of misunderstandings kick in. The first one being that digital labor might be, and this is the first misunderstanding we have to avoid, might be assimilated to the work of people who produce things around the internet, things being infrastructures and or software. We are not talking about hackers, we're not talking about developers, we are talking about a low intensity and low skilled kind of labor, which is associated mainly with user-generated content and user-generated metadata, or I should probably define it as user-extracted metadata. Just to give you a few examples, and actually my presentation is going to be all about examples. Well, you are familiar with a number of publishing platforms. Now, this is, again, the first and simplest example, but you will see that we'll be moving away from this first kind of digital labor. The first one being whatever you put online, whenever you published a video or a text or an article or a blog or a review on a number of social platforms. But of course, these audiovisual or multimedia contents cannot be understood without all the para-content that goes with it, being, for instance, the number of scores, evaluations, and reviews, and shares, and likes, that actually are another, and to tell the truth, the most prominent part of digital labor. Because what digital labor is about is mainly monetization of users' data. And by monetization, I mean that on a social platform such as Facebook, the very business model it revolves around the fact that the platform is capable of extracting data from users' behavior and to sell those data to relevant companies They could be other platforms, or it can be data brokers. In some cases, it's also some governments. And all these are used, of course, for a couple of things that are related to advertising, like real-time bidding and, of course, segmentation and personalization of advertising. So there is one way of interpreting what happens on social platforms, but this is kind of a metaphor, and you will see that this metaphor is more than that, more than a simple metaphor. Interprets anything that happens on digital platforms as, well, production, and digital platforms can be actually construed as social factories. Social because, well, one of the things that these companies sell are our very sociality. The social graph of any one of us is a valuable asset and actually a valuable commodity that is exchanged on such marketplaces. Why do we describe this situation as characterized by labor, or define as labor as such? Well, there are four main reasons. The first one being that these activities that we perform online every day produce value. And of course, I've just given you a few examples of for-sale data for ads and real-time bidding. The second criterion that allows us to describe whatever we do online, our online behaviors and online sociabilities as labor, is that they are framed in contractual terms. These terms are presented, for instance, as terms of service or community standards or a number of norms, but we can describe or construe them as actual contracts, like actual deals, like the one you would have with your employer, despite the fact that it's not employment, because, of course, these terms of service are tell you what will happen with the product, with the outcome of your production. So whatever you publish online, whatever you click online, will be dealt with in a specific way. And this is, of course, written down in these terms of service. The third criterion to describe these activities as labor is that they are subject to performance evaluation. Now, this performance evaluation is some kind of surreptitious activity that goes on whenever you find yourself confronted with the kind of scores and indicators that measure and quantify your activity online. Any one of us has a number of followers on Twitter or friends and contacts on Facebook. And of course, these kind of scores indicate the kind of user you are and also the kind of producer you are. And they can be assimilated to performance evaluation, especially because they are valuable to the very platforms. Just as, I don't know, shares and likes and a number of indicators that kind of quantify our activity online. The fourth criterion that gives us an idea of why we can characterize these activities as labor is that they are also subject to a requirement to contribute. Despite the fact that online presence and participation is presented as intentional and a voluntary activity, there are a number of coercive and forcing situations when we find ourselves confronted with the requirement to provide information to the system, prompted by the system to provide information or to participate. Think about the number of times that LinkedIn, for instance, if those of you have been using it, solicit you and kind of incites you to participate by sending you 4 or 5 invitations and say, oh, this is an invitation that is waiting for you, why don't you act on that? Or the reminders or the notifications, these are all the kind of systems and the kind of devices that are designed to prompt our participation and confront us with the requirement to contribute. Digital labor is not only associated to immaterial labor, because if we just focus on, I don't know, social media, this can probably be, easy to understand, but it's only one part of the bigger picture. The other part of the bigger picture that has been, well, emerging big time in the last few years is what we decided to call quite inappropriately as sharing economy, but it actually revolves around on-demand platforms and mobile apps. Sharing economy, well, okay, it's kind of a ruse. It's kind of well, also kind of a lie in some cases. These apps and these platforms present themselves as a chance to share with fellow users, but actually they are, well, data producing devices, and of course the most prominent example is embodied by Uber and the kind of Ubertarian ideology that goes with it, but Ubertarian being the hybrid between Uber and libertarian idea, the fact that anybody can become self-employed, whether you are a driver or even if you are actually a passenger, because what is important, and it's seldom reminded, is that Uber is, well, all about data. Well, the data that you have to create, that you have to provide to the app whenever you download it, and this you, the abstract you that I'm referring to, is first of all the drivers. Yes, in this case the working situation is clearly understandable, because as a driver you are confronted with this kind of dashboards where you can actually track your own activity, and you also know that somebody else is tracking it. But you are also have to work on your rating and on your reputation as a driver. So you have to always take into account the kind of reactions that passengers might have if you are not smile enough, if your car is not in perfect order, if you are not on time, and so on and so on. Yeah, okay, this is understandable, because when you drive, you see where labor is, where work is actually. But what about passengers? Well, passengers provide labor too, because passengers, they are evaluated themselves. And if you have ever downloaded Uber or any other app, you know that most of your time as a passenger is devoted to, choosing the right picture for your bio, or, writing down a nice profile or nice reviews about the drivers that, provide the service. And if you do not do it, well, you have a bad passenger score. And this bad passenger score turns into, well, a refusal of access or refusal of service. What happens is basically that if you have, as a passenger, if you have less than 4.5 as a passenger score, you will soon discover that it's 3 at night and you want a Uber and nobody's showing up because everybody, declines to provide this service to you. And of course, nobody will date you, as this Twitter says, but that's another point probably. Well, anyway, this is just to say that whether you situate yourself on the side of the driver or on the side of the actual service provider, or on the side of somebody who can be represented as a passive user of such app, we are all in the same situation, and this situation is characterized by providing labor for these platforms. Labor in terms of data that can be monetized. Now, another interesting activity and prominent one, and increasingly so, is an activity that can be characterized as training algorithms. Now, algorithms, of course, it's a long story. They might deserve, I think, 3 hours and another conference, of course, and there are a number of conferences on that. But one thing that is probably often forgotten about algorithms is that they do not exist without human being training them. You need to tell the algorithm what to do, or to train it to understand what to do. And one very simple example is what happens to us every day whenever we use Google search engine. The Google search engine needs to be trained by humans, because otherwise it does not understand what to do. Okay, this sentence is highly problematic. It does not understand. Well, understand it as a useful shortcut, semantic shortcut, because otherwise it would be longer. Anyway, whenever we type something in, we are providing data to Google. Google use those data to train its algorithm, and we are contributing to value production. One other example is represented by the reCAPTCHA system. I think that, well, all of you have been using it whenever you have to retrieve a password or to show that you are not a robot. You are invited to type in two words which are usually distorted and biased words, hardly recognizable. But what many of you do not know is that you are actually helping Google Books to scan the books. Well, actually, you are training the text recognition algorithm of Google Books, and in some cases the image recognition algorithm of other Google services. Because one of the things that Google has been implemented in the last few months is this thing, which is called actually the no captcha reCAPTCHA. And, well, cats, cats there everywhere on the internet. Well, it's not about cats. It's about training the Google image recognition algorithm. So to tell the system that you are not a robot, you have, for instance, to match these images. So the first one is a cat, and the others, some are canine, some are feline, some are just plants, some are, I don't know what kind of beasts they are. Anyway, as a human, you are able to make such a distinction. As an algorithm, it's more difficult, and well, algorithms need a little help from us. In some cases, this help is provided as an unpaid service that we provide to Google. In other cases, and this is also important to understand, we have to interpret what we do online in terms of digital labor as a continuum between complex and de-skilled penny tasks. I will tell you later what is a penny task, so meaning something which is paid a few cents or less than a cent. First of all, we have to interpret digital labor as something that sits in a continuum between highly complex tasks, like, I don't know, provide software development or network or building network and information systems, but where digital labor becomes interesting from a theoretical point of view and relevant from a social point of view is if we situate ourselves in the low complexity column of this table, where we, every time we sign up in websites, you search and you click, or you bookmark web pages, or you tag content, all these activities that are very everyday activities, low-skilled activities, they actually provide a huge amount of value for those platforms. And they also sit along a continuum between unpaid and macro-paid tasks, because what I've been showing you so far are just tasks that are unpaid labor, clicking on things and signing in and helping Google with the reCAPTCHA is just unpaid labor. But in other cases, there are a number of platforms that have been existent for, almost a decade now, that provide micropayment and that actually collect the contribution of a million of users. One of those is Amazon Mechanical Turk. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this service. The very idea of a mechanical Turk is kind of a metaphor. It's based on something that was kind of a legendary robot existing at the end of the 18th century. The Mechanical Turk was a chess-playing robot disguised as a Turk, but the legend goes that this Turk went from court to court and palace to palace, and eventually also Napoleon challenged the Turk to play chess. But it's a metaphor of the human behind or beyond the machine, because actually this Turk, it was discovered, was not a robot, but was an amputee that was operating the chess table. The checker, sorry. So what happens is basically that this metaphor translates in a service that goes like this. If you are a requester, meaning somebody who wants somebody else to perform tasks for him or her, you just go on Mechanical Turk and you say, I don't know, I want 1,000 people tagging pictures for me, or selecting music for me, or I don't know, recognizing cash tickets for me. I don't go into the specifics about why you want such things, but if you are a requester, you just formulate a request which is called a HIT, a human intelligent task, and you find a number of Turkers, meaning Turk workers, that accept or decline such request. Why is it called a HIT? Well, it's called a HIT because, algorithms have limits, and human beings can make what we now call artificial intelligence, meaning that it's not real artificial intelligence, meaning they act like algorithms would. But algorithms are bad, I don't know, at doing things like creating playlists of music. They do not process well this information, while us, well, we know what can be, I don't know, a romantic playlist or a reggae playlist or a mellow playlist for dancing, I don't know. So for a human being, it's just a matter of a few seconds, a few click, and it's done. And what do you earn as a Turk? Well, you micro-earn, actually. You have a micro-payment. This is kind of in una busta paga, huh? So it's a paycheck for someone at the end of the month. For a Turk, you see that some tasks are paid a few dollars, but a number of tasks are very skilled ones that are penny tasks that are paid just a few cents, or in some cases less than a cent. Now, again, this probably might seem to you like a strange and anecdotal number of examples, but actually behind this and behind the idea of digital labor, there is a changing definition of labor as such. One thing that is changing is definitely the kind of difference existing between productive activity and leisure. The kind of, découpage, the kind of split or in three situations that our grandparents used to know. We want 8 hours for labor, 8 hours for recreation or education, 8 hours for rest, now has become 24 hours of everything, every time. Think about the everyday experience. I think of any of you. You wake up in the morning, you've been sleeping close to this guy here, and the first thing you do before you take your first coffee is that you download your email and you do a first tour of your friends on Facebook. Is it work? Is it labor? Is it leisure? We don't know anymore, and this is why some people, some colleagues have been coming up with alternative definitions of labor, and they insist on the fact that we should probably talk about playbor, or the intersection of play and labor, because it's difficult to make a distinction between these two activities anymore. And in other cases, they talk about leisure, like work and leisure. And in some cases, they are, highlighting the fact that this kind of digital labor saturates our work and activity and puts ourselves in a situation that can be characterized as hyper-employment, meaning that not only we have our formal employment. In the best of the situation, we have it. In some cases, we don't. But when we go home, we have 6 more hours, 8 more hours of digital activity to provide. And in some cases, if you are a quantified self-person, you also provide data whenever you eat, whenever you sleep, and whenever you are, devoting yourself to other pleasurable activities. So, one thing that is important to understand digital labor is understanding the implicit dimension of labor. And this is nothing new. This is something that social sciences have been addressing for at least 1 century now. Actually, digital labor sits at the confluence, at the crossroads between at least 4 major traditions in social sciences or social analysis of media. The first one being, and this is also the historically older one, invisible labor, which is, of course, something that is at the center of a huge societal debate and political debate after the 1950s and 60s and 70s, insisting on the fact that a number of persons and parts of the population, like, for instance, women or minorities, or in some cases some marginal groups, provide labor that is functional to the very existence of the industrial and capitalistic system, and that we cannot envision productive activity if we do not also take into account the reproductive activity that is provided by all these social actors that I've been listing. And digital labor, in a way, is something like this. I mean, it's something that is halfway between production and reproduction, or something between production and sociability. And also one thing that digital labor has in common with this kind of invisible labor is that it's always facing the kind of criticism, yeah, but it's not really labor. If you post something on Facebook, it's not really labor. Why? Because you do it for pleasure. Yeah, but this is the same kind of bogus criticism that was addressed to invisible labor in the 60s and the 70s. Oh, you're a housewife, but you cannot describe yourself as a laborer because you're doing for love. Okay, yeah, you can have a dimension of love and pleasure and participation, but you cannot forget that there are a number of hierarchies and a kind of, coercion and other elements that are relevant here. Well, the link between digital labor and immaterial labor is probably more understandable because I've been providing a few examples that are that go in the direction of immaterial labor. Again, think about posting on Facebook as labor. The same thing goes with audience labor. Think about watching a video on YouTube and as such producing data for YouTube. But this is something that has been studied in the 70s and in the 80s about radio and about television and the way audience actually are producing labor for those channels of communication. And the last tradition is the most recent one, is the one about consumer work. And consumer work is the fact that in a situation where a value is co-produced by consumers and producers, we are now knowing a number of situations that are increasingly outsourcing some productive activities to the consumers. Think about going to the supermarket in 2015. Quite probably you will have to be your own cashier. You will, you would not go through a till, but you will scan things, and in this way providing some labor that otherwise would be provided by somebody else. Or think about IKEA. IKEA does not sell you furniture. They sell you the privilege of building your own furniture. So you become your own worker in many cases. So again, this is just to tell you that digital labor as a field of study does not exist in a vacuum. It does not, come up like a fancy invention. It's actually the evolution of a number of other existing fields of studies. And just to go towards the conclusion, it's also the evolution of a number of conflicts related to labor. These conflicts, I will now give you a quick overview of those. Now, first of all, creating and questioning many of the tactics and of the strategies related to labor mobilization, but in other cases, they are also pointing towards a convergence of the struggles between traditional workers and new implicit digital labor. The first type of conflict related to digital labor is the conflict pertaining to the remuneration of user-generated contents and user-generated data. It's quite problematic, the part about the data, the fact that nowadays a number of platforms are coming up with the possibility of providing wages or micro wages for your data. You give me your profile, I will sell it to advertisers, but you receive $20. Okay, again, it's highly problematic, but and I personally do not agree with this kind of direction. But again, this is something that is happening, and a number of conflicts are related to the fact of recognizing data as valuable assets and recognizing also content as valuable assets. One very clear example is, the class actions that have been targeting platforms such as Facebook and Google related to content and users' data. The sponsored stories of Google is a clear example, and the class action that is behind it, that Google can use your face and your pictures and your content and your friends to create sponsored stories. Like in this case, Kevin Mellon apparently likes FileMaker Pro, meaning that his face becomes the testimonial for this brand. And again, this is highly problematic. A few thousands of Facebook users have been, building up a class action, a number of class actions against this use of their data and this merchandization and monetization of their data. Another very successful so far examples of reaction towards this kind of monetization is embodied by this NGO called Europe versus Facebook. Many of you know this NGO because 1 week ago they succeeded in invalidating the safe harbor. Well, Max Schrems, which is the talking head for the NGO. But one other initiative of the Europe versus Facebook NGO was launched last year. They created a class action of 20,000 people, 25,000 Facebook users who demanded each a very symbolic amount of money, $500 each, for all the data that Facebook has been collecting over the years. Again, it's symbolic. They might have chosen $1. It would be the same. The fact is that this is a class action recognizing the value production and the value produced by users and the value extracted by platforms. A number of other informal and very, wildcat situations are also related to the data leaks and the data collectivization that have been happening over the last 5 years. These are usually presented in the press as cyber criminals doing something with your data. But many of those data leaks or data thefts were actually kind of a Robin Hoodish situation where they steal from the rich to give to anybody else, or kind of a Duruti situation where they collectivize data. One example might be Ashley Madison. Highly problematic. I'm not saying that this is ethically defendable, and I'm not saying that this is legally defendable, but again, this was a case of disgruntled users that were actually protesting against Ashley Madison's way of implementing their own right to be forgotten, meaning that you had to pay, I think $100 to be erased from the system. So what they did is they decided to just, sabotage the system as such, and so they decided to put everything online for the world to see. Again, not ethically defendable, but this is one way of protesting and one way of creating organized action against this kind of data extraction. Another kind of struggles are centered on platforms and on the working conditions of platform laborers. This is a nice example that comes from Germany. It is the IG Metall union. IG Metall, c'est les métallos. So one of the biggest German union that created a platform for platform labors. I don't know if you work for TaskRabbit or if you work for Mechanical Turk or if you work for Uber, you might want to evaluate your employer, and you can do it on such platform. Again, it's one way of creating an epistemic community of workers, but it's also a way of, pointing to problematic situations that can actually elicit labor movements or labor action. And this is something that was inspired by a Mechanical Turk-based initiative called the Turkopticon. Turkopticon is just an extension, an add-on for your browser. You install and you can evaluate requesters on Mechanical Turk. I don't know, people who pay, they don't pay you enough, or they are not fair, or they are not prompt in their reaction. You can evaluate them. You being a worker, and they being the requesters, meaning the kind of implicit employers. And one thing that Mechanical Turkopticon did was that it evolved quite recently into the first union of Mechanical Turk workers. It's called Dynamo, and it's been all over the news in the last 12 months. There is also an opportunity for convergence of struggles against this kind of digital labor and the abuses of digital labor. And one example I want to rapidly talk about is this one, Uber again. Well, Uber is, again, something that is described in the press as provoking labor mobilization, also, but only in these terms. What happened here in Paris a few months ago, meaning that traditional corporative labor structures, like could be, I don't know, taxi drivers here in Paris, they have a very bad press, in some cases rightly so, but what they did in terms of course of protest was described as a Luddite reaction towards innovation. What actually is labor in industrial mobilization against labor conditions that become increasingly difficult to sustain because of Uber. And one thing that goes in this direction, and goes also in the direction of possible convergence of struggles of taxi drivers and of Uber drivers, is something that happened 2 days ago. Meaning that the Uber drivers, they decided to unionize themselves, and they decided also in some cases to go on strike with taxi drivers. So this is something that goes in the direction of a possible convergence of traditional labor struggles and new digital labor struggles. And the last kind of possible movement that can be associated to this, but it's very nascent, and personally I'm very curious, and I'm planning on doing research on this, is the global north, global south divide, and the kind of click labor movements that are developing in those countries. I think that many of you are familiar with the fact that most of the things that are moderated, meaning censored online, are moderated by people who usually live in Indonesia or in the Philippines or in Pakistan, who spend their days watching, pictures of naked women that should not be on Facebook, or very violent images, and their work is commercial moderation, content moderation. This, again, is one kind of labor that is low intensity, and this is associated with what we watch on those, or with the kind of content that circulate on those platforms. One other thing that happens in the same countries is that there is a growing number of people who work in click farms. Click farms provide, clicks to platforms such as Facebook. You know that nowadays, Facebook gives you the opportunity to promote your content. If you want your post to be viewed by more people, you can pay, $20 or $500, and they insure you, they tell you that, 1,000 people or 20,000 people will click on your content or share your content. They don't tell you where these people come from. They usually come from, again, the global south. And again, they spend their days in click farms or at their own home clicking on things. And they are micropaid for this, meaning that they are paid a few cents or 0.005 cents per click. one thing that is happening is that for those who are interested in the geographies of inequalities too, this is creating a very polarized situation where, if you look at people who, provide employment on those platforms and people who are employed by those platforms, you will see that the employers are represented by the pink color, and the employees, the laborers, are represented by the red color. All the red part is usually in countries that start at the Middle East, North Africa, and of course become huge in places like Indonesia or Pakistan or Philippines, in some cases China and Russia and Ukraine. So again, these points towards a very interesting development that can go also in the direction of, first of all, developing local struggles in those countries, struggles for the recognition of the rights of those micro-laborers, micro-digital laborers, and then also to inscribe those struggles in a wider question, which is, of course, related to the inequalities that the data that flow from those countries to our countries create. And so this is basically it. This is basically it. I don't go into the role of the regulators because it's too late. Thank you very much.
Just one small question about the figures in the money flow in the last image with all the...
Yeah, the circus. It comes from the research from Mark Graham.
Doesn't seem to be, if I understand, this is a logarithmic scale and goes... So we're talking about millions of dollars. It's not huge. It's not a
no, I mean, this is just
it's not billions.
No, it's actually it's millions of dollars. It's it's basically on Odesk, which is actually a smaller platform.
Okay, good.
Which looks like a lot like Mechanical Turk, but if it were,
you can extrapolate maybe to billion dollars in that case. Okay. So one question. The question is, I'm convinced by the fact that there is a category to be redefined of digital labor, and that some of the things that you say are quite striking and interesting about the way labor modifies itself. But still, I'm a bit confused about some of the elements in the mechanics of the labor here. So, for instance, when we talk about this type of labor, as it's just made on social platforms, but it is really individual labor. It's always individual labor. So this is a point I wanted to make sure I got properly. And this suggests also that the low-skill labor is actually moving towards something even lower skill, which is no complexity labor at all. If people are going to wear wearable computers, they don't have to do anything basically. They just have to live and do whatever they do without having to make anything that looks like to them like a contribution. They're just being observed doing something. Like Maurizio was showing us proudly his wearable, which collects the pace he's doing each day. And I mean, this is a kind of labor. There is a small ascent at the beginning, and it's likely that most labor is going to be like that in no time, because technology moves that fast. And this is also for saying a second thing, which is related to the mechanics. So no contract labor in a sense is going to be, no contract at all. But the mechanics is that where we are in a situation in which you're making small transactions, one side of which is to be considered as labor. Say, I decide to mutually exchange localization information with my wife for anxiety reasons. It's a transaction between two consentant adults. So we decided to be mutually geolocalized. We never do it, but let's say. Then it's an individual transaction, but if we produce it produced on a larger scale, it has ecological import in the sense that it changes the defaults of the system. So Maurizio's last book was called Where Are You? And now the question that you're going to ask is, actually, where are you? Because you're no longer geolocalizable. Why aren't you geolocalizable? The question becomes a stigma question.
Yeah, sure.
So people are going to be stigmatized. And this is an important part of the mechanics, I would say, which is simply by changing individual transactions change the defaults of the system. And then by not doing anything, I mean, I'm not doing anything more immoral or illegal and just not doing anything, I'm stigmatized.
Stigmatized, yeah, for not producing. Well, thank you for the question, because it's actually the questions. I probably will start with, from the end, because the example that you provided is quite striking, because, you know, exchanging geolocation data with your wife, for anxiety reasons, you said the first thing that popped in my mind was jealousy. But again, yeah, it's an example which is fascinating because, again, it's the right example because it kind of shows that behind this kind of requests for data, there are always elements, despite the fact there is it's a transaction between consenting adults, there are some elements of coercion, some elements of social obligation, some elements of pressure, interpersonal pressure, and again, we are facing an injunction to participate. And this injunction to participate is, of course, the one which is conducive to what you were saying at the beginning of your question, what you described as individual labor, as low-skilled labor. There is one way of, you know, summarizing these traits in only one trait, which is actually what Georges Friedman, the French sociologist, described as the work in crumbs, the travail en miettes, fragmented work. And what we are facing is a labor picture which is characterized by a high level of atomization and a high level of fragmentation, and fragmentation from a social point of view, meaning that we, in this kind of situation, this kind of technical systems put us in a situation of social isolation, despite the fact that we are more connected. And the other point is that this work is not specifically low-skilled, but it's de-skilled, meaning that because it automatizes a number of tasks, puts us in a situation of losing some of the skills that we might have been having in the past. The interesting part, interesting also in terms of the kind of way to escape this, because again, I'm describing this this kind of bleak picture, but I'm not a pessimist, I'm not a critic of this. I'm somebody who is pointing to a number of strategies of resistance, struggle, and renegotiation of this kind of balance that I've described. And I think that the best chance for our renegotiation comes from connected objects and IoT, rightly because the IoT kind of changes the balance between professional life and private life, between the professional sphere and the private sphere. Think about a connected home. The fact that when you finished work, you go home to a connected thermostat who is, you know, dialoguing with your Wi-Fi and your fridge and your microwave and your dustbin. All this is connected, but all this is turning your house in a data sweatshop. So again, what are the strategies of, in some cases, sabotage, in some cases, resistance, but in many, many other cases of adaptation and, the most interesting to me, détournement of this situation. Détournement is, to me, the main strategies that will be used by human collectives, small collectives, like, you know, if you think about a house, you think about also, in some cases, families, and, you know, how they can cope with it, how can they escape this kind of data extraction, and, of course, this kind of value extraction that comes with it. Open question, and waiting for an answer, personally.
Maurizio?
I obviously appreciated so much your presentation. Also because you mentioned this sociological question about travail en miettes. What shows this transformation of labor is that labor in itself is a much more abstract concept that was traditionally thought even by Marxist analysis of work. And this is something that helps us, I mean, those who still speak about the analysis of capital should transform their analysis in the analysis of web, because web is now the real structure in which you will understand what is no more properly called capital. I believe that there is a problem for all the political thought that still speaks about capital. I'm not a conservative who says that capital does not exist, but still speaks about a concept that implies the existence of a program, of an alienation. What we see is that the question is different. To go to the more concrete action that one can do is, for instance, to transform the existing authorities for privacy in authorities for in trade union for hidden labor. Because in fact, as I said before, still seems that the great problem is privacy. The great problem is the work, the hidden labor.
First of all, and we will come back to that, I think that this will bring us back to what you were saying about alienation, which I enormously appreciated. First of all, well, what you describe as labor as an abstract concept, I would rephrase it in probably a different way, and probably also explain why we talk about digital labor and not digital work. Because work has been traditionally, and meaning for several centuries, described as a physical activity that transforms physical systems, while labor is traditionally described, at least in English, as not only that, but also the set of social relations that go, and cultural constructs that go with this kind of work. So, given the fact that work has changed, labor has changed, and in this case we are focusing on digital labor because we are focusing on the kind of social balances that, or the kind of social settings that this productive activity is creating. Then, to go back to the idea of alienation, what I have appreciated about your description is that alienation's theories always rely on the three dimensions that you pointed, the one of intentionality, autonomy, and the meaning-building one. And of course, the word alienation is well, often, unfortunately, used when we talk about digital labor, especially because when I come up with this kind of criticism, somebody in the audience is always ready to say, oh yeah, but you see, mobile technologies are alienating. Okay, this is usually Sherry Turkle, but anyway. Again, the problem is that we are facing what can be characterized by a high exploitation from an informational point of view and a low alienation system, technical system, or set of technical systems. By high exploitation and low alienation, I basically mean that these technical devices are able to extract a lot of information and produce a lot of value. So this is the standard definition of exploitation, at least exploitation de l'information, you see. And then on the other side, alienation is low. Why? Because these devices do not put into question our, existing in a human collective or our very identity. On the contrary, they shape our identity. They go with our social collectives. We, are on Facebook to be connected to the people we already know. We, express ourselves on any kind of platforms because we want to build our identity. So they are not putting into question this. They are, again, probably we are facing the need for a redefinition of the very notion of alienation. But again, I I think that we are not facing alienation at all in this case, luckily for us. We find ourselves in a situation which is probably best described by Carlo Formenti's phrase, we are felici e sfruttati. We are happy and we're exploited, but again, exploited in an informational, from an informational point of view more than a Marxist point of view. And
also because just
yeah.
the man working on the web is the not alienated man in Marxist terms.
Well, to an extent. I think that Marx would agree at least with one thing, that alienation is not a psychological status in his theory. What he describes as alienation is the separation between the worker and the product of its work. And from this point of view, it's more expropriation. It's more that we do not own anymore many of the data that circulate on those platforms. This is another point. And probably, and just to conclude quickly on your proposal to turn the data authorities into labor authorities, I'm not saying that there is anything going on going in this direction in France or in Europe, to the best of my knowledge. First of all, because labor authorities historically emerge from grassroots movements and not from state-driven political innovation. I think that at least for France, the CNIL is highly sensitive to this kind of discourse, and I mean I've been close to the CNIL for a number of years, and things are happening, but in another domain. I think that one domain which is looking at digital labor studies with a lot of interest is the one of tax and fiscal policies. And this was actually the last part of my presentation, but I won't go into that. There's a lot of attention to what do platforms do with our data to, levy taxes on them.
A question about the fact that much of these platform, social network, for example, are free. Google is free, so I wonder whether what you call labor, and many scholars call labor in the case of user-generated content or user-generated metadata, can maybe be redescribed as a price to pay. Simply, it's a ticket to pay in order to have. Also, the case of IKEA that you mentioned before. In fact, you pay less than in another shop, and then of course you have some labor to do, since you have pay. They just sell you the pieces and you have to finish that. So I wonder whether in some cases I agree it's intuitive for me that it's really labor, as for example in the case of the Mechanical Turk or the Uber case. But these cases, I wonder whether it's rather a form of ticket to pay, a price to pay for a service, rather than a true labor.
Okay. To tell you the truth, this is a standard question when it comes to digital labor, and to tell you the truth, the standard answer that one can provide is that these platforms are nominally free, meaning that they describe themselves as free platforms, but they are ways, of course, of selling you things that eventually make you pay the price that you did not pay at the beginning. Meaning, for instance, that on Facebook you do not pay to sign up, but you are bombarded by ads, or your data is sold to other platforms that eventually bombard you with ads that at the end make you, tailored offers that usually are adapted to the kind of price you can pay. So eventually you end up paying for these on the price of your next flight ticket, or the next, nappies for your baby, or any other commodities that you might buy otherwise in other places. So again, we should probably look at where the actual payment lays, and probably this payment has been simply displaced. Again, probably this is also to answer your question that we pay less. Probably we do not pay less on an aggregate level, meaning that if we put together all the things that we've been paying in the last few years, sincerely, economists are not sure that, the working classes or the middle classes are in a better situation price-wise from many situations. When we are in a better situation, it's usually when we evade data tracking and data surveillance. meaning that we put in place some kind of strategies or some kind of tactics that avoid this kind of data extraction. But you were also pointing to a theoretical aspect of the very idea of being online, and you know, the fact that usually they say when you do not pay, you are the product. Well, in the case of digital labor, when you do not pay, it's that you are the worker. You're actually co-producing the thing that is sold, the service that is sold. The point is not the participation or the co-production, the production. The problem is mainly a matter of redistribution of value over the value chain, or the redistribution of value between users and producers. In present-day situation, platforms such as social media create a humongous amount of reach and of revenues, and you know, the social collectives, meaning the social body, does not receive back the kind of value that it produces. So it's a matter of fairness, it's a matter of equalities, and it's a matter of finding a balance between this kind of situation.
Yeah. You talked about strategies for resistance in relation to this. No, I wonder, because I am from the art field, and I wonder what kind of strategies could be. For example, not only monetary value, also ironic construction, critical value, anti-environmental strategies. If you could explain.
Strategies of resistance. I'm never thinking about a refusal of use. This kind of Luddite strategies have proven to be quite ineffective. I've been pointing to some very controversial, but in my opinion, extremely interesting, if they can develop in another direction, strategies such as collectivization of data, because what I'm interested in is creating data commons, and in general creating alternative ways of building platforms. And one very interesting set of political experiences that has been emerging in the last few years revolves around cooperative platforms. And actually, this is the title of a big conference that will take place in New York in a few months. Platform cooperativism is a growing movement that sprung from, the side of digital labor field of studies, and basically mean, just to give you a quick example, what would happen if Uber was a cooperative? What would happen if it was a mutualistic society owned and managed by the very users? So this is probably an alternative that can emerge.
There is, in a way, an implicit assumption that there is a lot of value being extracted residing in the data or the knowledge or the ability to resell or whatever. And I wonder whether one could not think that actually the real challenge the fact that there is so much data that is extracted in that manner, but at the same time look rather at the shaping of behavior, or what you described rightly as a kind of accompaniment of the formation of the behavior, that would be not a means to extract data value, but the real space in which value is being produced for the. And I mentioned this because if you look at some of the internal messages of Google about what it is as a company, I mean, he will speak much more about this shaping behavior than about just selling targeted advertising or whatever, which is its reality as an economic player.
That, of course, this agrees with what Maurizio Ferrari said about, well, the way he characterizes mobilization in terms of, always being prompted by technical systems to act on alerts or recommendations or messages. This is the kind of situation that shapes the behaviors, and of course is the actual value, for better or worse, that is extracted and created by those platforms. Yeah. Well,
thank you.
I think it's all.
Thank you.